Hello, ladies and gentlemen, folks, welcome to another chapter reading. This will be Chapter 8, Section 5 for Goblin Heights World History. Mr. Daldis here, going to read for you Section 5, A Time of Crisis. As you can see by these pictures and some of the depictions on this page, this is not a very happy time in European history. And this is actually going to be a global issue, a pandemic very similar to what we have now called the Black Death or the bubonic plague. It's going to lead to widespread sickness and in almost all cases death. So we'll start off with the focus question. How did the combination of the plague, upheaval in the church, and war affect Europe in the 1300s and 1400s? A time of crisis. To Europeans in the mid-1300s, the end of the world seemed to have come. First, widespread crop failures brought famine and starvation. Then, plague and war ravaged populations. Europe eventually recovered from these disasters. Still, the upheavals of the 1300s and 1400s marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern age. The Black Death, a global epidemic. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships loaded with grain left the Black Sea port of Kaffa and set sail for Messina, Sicily. By mid-voyage, sailors were falling sick and dying. Soon after the ships tied up in Messina, townspeople too began to fall sick and die. Within months, the disease that Europeans called the Black Death was raging through Italy. By 1348, it had reached Spain and France. From there, it ravaged the rest of Europe. 1 in 3 people died, a death rate worse than any war in history. The plague spreads from Asia. The sickness was bubonic plague, a disease spread by fleas carried by rats. Bubonic plague had broken out before in Europe, Asia, and North Africa, but had subsided. One strain, though, had survived in Mongolia. In the 1200s, Mongol armies conquered much of Asia, probably setting off the new epidemic, or outbreak of rapid spreading disease. In the pre-modern world, rats infested ships, towns, and even homes of the rich and powerful, so no one took any notice of them. In the early 1300s, rats spread the plague in crowded Chinese cities, which killed about 35 million people there. Fleas jumped from those rats to infest the clothes and packs of traders traveling west. As a result, the disease quickly spread from Asia to the Middle East and then to Europe. Normal life breaks down. In Europe, the plague brought terror and bewilderment as people had no way to stop the disease. Some people turned to magic and witchcraft for cures. Others plunged into wild pleasures, believing they would soon die anyway. Still, others saw the plague as God's punishment. They beat themselves with whips to show that they repented their sins. Normal life broke down as people fled cities or hid in their homes to avoid contracting the plague from neighbors and relatives. Some Christians blamed Jews for the plague, charging unjustly that they had poisoned the wells to cause the disease. In the resulting hysteria, thousands of Jews were slaughtered. The economy suffers. As the plague kept recurring in the late 1300s, the European economy plunged to a low ebb. When workers and employers died, production declined. Survivors demanded higher wages, and as the cost of labor soared, inflation, or rising prices, broke out too. Landowners and merchants pushed for laws to limit wages. To limit rising costs, landowners converted croplands to land for sheep raising, which required less labor. Villagers forced off the land looked for work in towns. There, guilds limited opportunities for advancement. Coupled with the fear of the plague, these restrictions sparked explosive revolts. Bitter, angry peasants rampaged in England, France, and Germany, and elsewhere. In the cities, artisans fought for more power, usually without success. Revolts erupted on and off throughout the 1300s and 1400s. The plague had spread both death and social unrest. Western Europe would not fully recover from the effects for more than 100 years. Upheaval in the Church. The late Middle Ages brought spiritual crisis, scandal, and division to the Roman Catholic Church. Many priests and monks died during the plague. Their replacements faced challenging questions. Survivors asked, "Why did God spare some and kill others?" The church splits. The church was unable to provide the strong leadership needed in these desperate times. In 1309, Pope Clement V had moved the papal court to Avignon, outside the border of southern France. It remained there for about 70 years under French domination. In Avignon, popes reigned over a lavish court. Critics lashed out against the worldly, pleasure-loving papacy, and anti-clerical sentiment grew. Within the church itself, reformers worked for change. In 1378, reformers elected their own pope to rule from Rome. French cardinals responded by choosing a rival pope. For decades, there was a schism or split in the church. During this schism, 2 and sometimes even 3 popes claimed to be the true vicar of Christ. A church council at Constance, Germany finally ended the crisis in 1417 by removing authority from all 3 popes and electing a compromise candidate. Pope Martin V returned the papacy to Rome. Responding to new heresies. As the moral authority of the church weakened, popular preachers began to call for change. In England, John Wycliffe, an Oxford professor, attacked corruption in the church. Wycliffe insisted that the Bible, not the church, was the source of Christian truth. His followers began translating the Bible into English so that people could read it themselves, rather than rely on the clergy to interpret it. Czech students at Oxford carried Wycliffe's ideas to Bohemia, today's Czech Republic. There, Jan Hus led the call for reforms, supported by his followers, known as Hussites. The church responded by persecuting Wycliffe and his followers and suppressing the Hussites. Huss was tried for preaching heresy, ideas contrary to church teachings. Found guilty, he was burned at the stake in 1415. The ideas of Wycliffe and Huss survived, however. A century later, the reformers took up the same demands. The 100 Years' War. At the top of the disasters of famine, plague, and economic decline came long, destructive war. Between 1337 and 1453, England and France engaged in a series of conflicts known as the 100 Years' War. French and English rivalry grows. English rulers had battled for centuries to hold on to French lands of their Norman ancestors, but French kings were intent on extending their own power in France. When Edward III of England, whose mother had been a French princess, claimed the French crown in 1337, war erupted anew between these rival powers. England and France were also rivals for control of the English Channel, the waterway between their countries. Each also wanted to control trade in the region. Once fighting started, economic rivalry and a growing sense of national pride made it hard for either side to give up the struggle. The English win early victories. At first, the English won a string of victories. At Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, and Agincourt in 1415. They owe much of their success to the new longbow wielded by English archers. For a time, it looked as though England would bring all of France under its control. Then, in what seemed like a miracle to the French, their fortunes were reversed. Joan of Arc fights for the French. Joan of Arc fights for France. In 1429, a 17-year-old peasant woman, Joan of Arc, appeared at the court of Charles VII, the uncrowned king of France. She told him that God had sent her to save France. Desperate, Charles authorized her to lead an army against the English. To Charles' amazement, Joan inspired the battered and despairing French troops to fight anew. In one astonishing year, she led the French to several victories and planted the seeds for future triumphs. Joan paid for success with her life. She was taken captive by allies of the English and turned her over to the enemies for trial. To discredit her, the English had Joan tried for witchcraft. She was convicted and burned at the stake. Much later, however, the church declared her a saint. The execution of Joan rallied the French, who saw her as a martyr. After Joan's death, the French took the offensive. With a powerful new weapon, the cannon, they attacked English-held castles. By 1453, the English held only the port of Calais in northwestern France. Impact of the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War set France and England on different paths. The war created a growing sense of national feeling in France and allowed French kings to expand their power. On the other hand, during the war, English rulers turned repeatedly to Parliament for funds, which helped that body win the power of the purse. Power in English government began to swing towards the Parliament. While the loss of French land shattered English dreams of a continental empire, English rulers turned to new trading ventures overseas. The Hundred Years' War brought many changes to the late medieval world. Castles and armored knights were doomed to disappear because their defenses could not stand up to the more deadly firepower of the longbow and the cannon. Society was changing. Monarchs needed large armies, not feudal vassals, to fight their wars. More and more they turned to hired soldiers to do their fighting. As Europe recovered from the Black Death, the population expanded, and the manufacturing grew. These changes led to increased trade. Italian cities flourished as centers of trade and shipping. Europeans borrowed and developed new technologies. This recovery set the stage for further changes during the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Exploration. That is the end of Chapter 8, Section 5, and also the end of Chapter 8 altogether. If you have any questions, pause the video and go back to the moments you need to. Thanks for listening, guys. Have a great day.